So what we're going to be doing in this lesson is using something called the order of operations to evaluate algebraic expressions. I think this should be pretty straightforward, should be a review for you guys. I think you've seen order of operations probably a number of times in the past. I'm sure you have all sorts of different mnemonic devices to remember. We're going to walk through, we're going to write the steps in normal English phrases here, and then talk about some mnemonic devices and look at a couple of example problems. Okay, so some new vocabulary that you should be aware of. Variables, if you recall, they represent unknown quantities, things like x, y, and z. Algebraic expressions are expressions that contain variables, algebraic things, not just numerical things. Order of operations we are about to learn about, and formulas will come in your next section, your next note section from 1.1. All right, so order of operations, like I said, we're going to write them out in plain English and then talk about little tricky, easy ways to remember them. Okay, order of operations, step number 1 is to evaluate expressions inside grouping symbols. Okay, so here we use the phrase grouping symbols instead of just saying parentheses. I'm sure you're used to the first step being parentheses, but we could also have things like brackets, parentheses inside of parentheses, things like that. And then technically, if you have a quotient, grouping the numerator versus grouping the denominator is also considered to be a grouping symbol. So we're kind of advancing that step and calling it grouping symbols. Next step, evaluate all powers. Now, powers would be something like you see down here. That's the third power, also known as exponents. Step 3, multiply and or divide, whichever you need to do. From left to right. Now you may need to multiply, you may need to divide, you may need to do both. Some things that people forget about, you don't do all the multiplication first, then all the division. You kind of do them as one joint step, but you move from left to right. That's the important part right here. And then final step, very similar to step 3, we add and or subtract from left to right. Okay, so what I'm sure many of you remember is the acronym Pemdas. You may have just said that, like just the made-up word that comes from those kind of 6 steps. So P stands for parentheses, but remember we talked about advancing it to grouping symbols. E stands for exponents, aka powers, multiply and divide from left to right, and then add or subtract from left to right. You might also remember, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. You probably did that. My husband claims he remembered it as Patrick Ewing's mom does awesome slams. I don't know if that's relevant to you at all. Patrick Ewing was a basketball star in the 90s. Many of you were born in the late 90s, but you've got many options there to remember the order of operations. PEMDAS probably being the easiest one. So we're just going to go through a couple of quick examples here. This first example, we're going to evaluate this algebraic expression by subbing in these options for x and for y. Okay, so I'm going to color code to hopefully make things easier for you. So we've got x equals 1, and then we have y equals 4. So we're going into this expression right here, and then like I said, every time you see an x, you're going to replace it with a 1. Every time you see a y, you're going to replace it with a 4. So instead of x minus y, we are going to plug in a 1 for x, and then minus a 4 for y. And then we've got this little exponent on the outside, and then don't forget about this plus 3 after all of that. Okay, so we're going to follow the order of operations here. So first, evaluate the expressions inside grouping symbols. That means we're doing this first. We're inside parentheses. 1 minus 4, you do that subtraction first, and we're going to end up with a negative 3. And then there's a third power on the outside, plus 3. So lots of 3's here. Step 2, evaluate all powers. So this power on the outside, the third power means you multiply this by itself 3 times. So -3 times -3 times -3. So if we just do 2 of them, -3 times -3 is +9. And then if we multiply times a -3 again, we end up with -27. All right, and then again, still don't forget about that +3. Multiply or divide from left to right. There's no multiplication or division, so we jump to step 4, add or subtract from left to right. So we're going to add -27 plus 3, and so we end up with a -24. All right, so that would be your final answer. Now, if you had done things in a different order, you wouldn't have gotten the same answer, which is why it's so important to have this order of operations. Okay, next example here. Example 2, we've got part A and part B. So all of these, we've got n's and t's. We're going to replace them with these values right here. So I will color code again. Okay, so n is 2, and then minus t is a 3.4. And then in parentheses, we've got n squared, so 2 squared minus t, which is 3.4. Okay, so we start with anything inside of grouping symbols, so that would be this right here. Now notice we've got a bunch of stuff happening inside the grouping symbols. So once you're inside, parentheses, brackets, whatever, order of operations kind of starts over again. So we'd start with this exponent. So I'm just going to rewrite all of these. So 2 squared, 2 times 2 is 4. And then we're still kind of on step 1 because we need to do this step right here. So I'm going to transfer it up over here. So 4 minus 3.4 is 0.6. Okay, now next step is exponents or powers. We don't have any of those. And then next is multiplying or dividing. This is technically multiplication. The 3.4 outside of the 0.6 technically means that you're supposed to be multiplying those together. Now we're dealing with decimals, so if you can multiply that in your head, great. I'd prefer that you are at least practicing some simple skills like this and not just jumping right to your calculator. All right, so remember how to do some of these things. So 2 decimal places like this means we move 2 decimal places at the end. So that is actually a 2.04. So that's step 3, multiply or divide. Last step is to either add or subtract. So we do 2 minus 2.04. That leaves us with a negative 0.04. So that is your final answer. Okay, and our last one right here, part B, we've got 3 different variables. I think I'm going to skip the color coding if you don't mind. We've got 8xy, so we start with 8, which is just there. X, we sub in a 5, x equals 5 right here. Y, we're going to sub in a negative 2, that's our second variable, plus z cubed, so sub in a negative 1 for z, and then we've got the cubed on the outside, all of that over y squared, so a negative 2 squared plus 5. Okay, so step 1 is grouping symbols. Like I said before, the numerator and denominator kind of being separated out like that, that's technically a grouping symbol. So we go within this right here, start with the first step, which is going to be the exponent. So we're not even touching that first part at all. And then negative 1 cubed is negative 1 times negative 1, which is positive 1, and then times a negative 1 again, which is negative 1. So now we can also start to simplify this. Negative 2 squared is negative 2 times itself, which is positive 4. Okay, keep on simplifying. Next, we're going to multiply from left to right. So we're going to multiply all these together. So 8 times 5, that's 40. And then times negative 2 gives us a negative 80 plus a negative 1. And then over 4 plus 5. So finally, we work on the addition and subtraction. So we've got negative 80 plus a negative 1. That's a negative 81. 4 plus 5 is 9. So now last, we do have to kind of simplify this up here because negative 81 divided by 9 is able to be simplified. So negative 81 over 9 reduces down to negative 9. Okay, all set on that first part. So this second half of 1-1, we're going to be talking about formulas. And so it's very similar to what we just did, except a formula is something that's kind of predefined. The definition is that it's a mathematical sentence that expresses relationship between quantities. So you learned a lot about these in geometry, so this first one probably looks familiar. So the area of a trapezoid is given right here. 1/2 times the height, and then times the sum of the bases. H is the height, 2 bases here. So what we're doing is we've got this last sentence here that gives us some of the information that we want to use. All we're going to do is we're going to answer this, find the area, just by plugging in these values into this given formula. So very similar to what the first half of this section was. Just like I said, these are now commonly known formulas that you'd use in areas like geometry. So find the area. So A equals, so we start with this formula right here. So 1/2 and then times H. Well, H is given as, let's see, here it is, height of 8 meters. Okay, so height of 8 meters, we're going to sub in 8 for height, and then times the sum of the bases. So in parentheses, we have a base of 13 meters and then a base of 25 meters. So 13 for the first base, doesn't matter which one, I'm just writing it first because it was listed first, and then 25. Okay, so now once that's written out, then we jump back to what the order of operations would tell us to do first. So it first tells us to deal with grouping symbols. So we've got this right here. This is also technically a grouping symbol just because of the way I wrote it, but there's nothing to do inside that set of parentheses. It's just an 8. So we start here inside this set of parentheses, which tells us to add those two together. So leave everything else exactly the way it's written. So 13 plus 25 gives us 38. And then the next step is exponents. We don't have any. Next step is to multiply or divide. So that's what we're going to be doing next. Now, multiplication, we have something called the commutative property. Something called the associative property, which we're going to be learning about in a couple sections. And what that tells us is that we can multiply in any order that we want. So whatever you find easiest. If you want to multiply 1/2 times 8 first, or if you want to multiply 1/2 by 38 first, or 8 times 38, whatever you want. I'd say multiplying 1/2 times 8 is pretty easy, so I'm going to start there. So 1/2 times 8 is basically taking half of 8, and so that would be 4, and then you multiply that by 38. So like I said, I want you to have strong skills, multiplication skills, addition skills. Calculators are great. You should be able to do something like this by hand very quickly. So 8 times 4 is 32, carry the 3, 3 times 4 is 12, and then add the 3 back on. Okay, so we've got 152, and then when you're dealing with formulas, geometry, any sort of story problems, it's really important that you have whatever units they gave you. So meters for both of these. Remember, area is always going to be squares, square feet, square meters, square centimeters. So you write 152 meters squared, and that would be your final answer. Okay, example 4 is our only other problem we're going to look at. And this is a special formula for the area of a triangle, one you guys probably haven't heard of before. This was created by a mathematician named Heron. And so this is our formula. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 different variables. S is given by this right here, and then A, B, and C are the lengths of the 3 sides. Okay, so we're going to start by coming up with S. So we've got 3 sides. Now it doesn't matter which one's A, B, and C. Doesn't matter at all. So we'll start by finding S, and then we'll sub all that into this formula. So S is A plus B plus C. So that means we add the 3 side lengths together. So 6 plus 11 plus 14. And then the formula says to divide it all by 2. So remember, like I said in the last note section, grouping technically means like the numerator is grouped together and the denominator is grouped together. So we're going to add all of these. So 6 plus 11 gives us 17. And then plus 14 gives us 31. So the numerator is 31, and then divide that by 2. Okay, so 31 divided by 2, you can leave it as an improper fraction like that. You can write it as a decimal if you want to. That would be 15.5. Your call. Okay, so this we are definitely going to want to use a calculator for. So we've got that 15.5, which is obviously a decimal, or you could have left it in fraction form. And then to top things off, our formula involves a square root. So there's kind of a lot going on in that formula, and we are definitely going to want to have a calculator to do that, okay? So let's plug everything in. So A equals, we've got a big square root symbol with all this stuff underneath. So start with S, so 15.5. And then in parentheses, we have S minus A, so 15.5 minus the first side length, which is 6. Again, doesn't matter which order you put them in. Then S minus B, so 15.5 minus the next side length, which is 11. And then 15.5 minus the last side length, which is 14. So like I said, we're going to want a calculator. So your calculator screen looks something like this when you first turn it on. So you want to do a new document. We want to avoid using Scratchpad, but I'll talk about that in class. So new document. If you have anything saved, no, there's no need to save it. We're going to go to just a calculator page. That's what you'll typically be using. So type in exactly what you have on this screen right here. Okay, so the square root button, if you find the 4, the number 4 is right here. Just to the left of it, there's an x squared, and above that is the square root. So hit the control and then the square root. And then you're basically just going to type this out exactly as it's written. So 15.5. And then just like these are in parentheses, you're going to use parentheses, which are right next to the 0. There's an open and close right here. So open parentheses, 15.5 minus 6, close them. Open 15.5 minus 11. And last set of parentheses, 15.5 minus 14. Okay, so when you hit enter, it'll give you a decimal approximation, which is about 31 point, let's do 2 decimal places. I would get in that habit. So 31.53. The 6 would round the 2 up to a 3. And what we're going to do when we write this answer is we're going to put a little squiggly equal sign, which means it's not an exact answer. We rounded it, so that's an approximation. So you say the area is approximately equal to, not exactly equal to. So 31.53, and then since these are inches, the area will be in inches squared.